Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. So I'm gonna share something that happened to me about 3 years ago up in Tennessee that still gives me the creeps when I think about it. At the time, I was 58 and had just retired after 32 years working as a lineman for the electric company. Bought myself a little cabin up near Rowan Mountain. Figured I'd earned some peace and quiet after all those years climbing poles and fixing power lines in all kinds of weather. The place was perfect. About 2 acres of wooded land, closest neighbor maybe half a mile down the mountain road. Just me and my German Shepherd mix, Buster, who I'd rescued from the pound a few months after moving up there. The cabin wasn't fancy, but it had everything I needed. A wood stove, a decent kitchen, and a wraparound porch where I could sit with my coffee in the mornings and watch the mist roll through the trees. Life was simple, exactly how I wanted it after decades of dealing with power outages and emergency calls at all hours. The whole thing started on a Tuesday night in late October. I remember it was unseasonably warm for that time of year, maybe mid-60s even after dark. I'd spent the day splitting firewood and had just settled into my recliner with a beer and the evening news when Buster started acting weird. He was lying by the front door like he always did, but suddenly his head shot up and his ears went straight. Then he started doing this low, growling thing, not aggressive, but more like he was trying to tell me something. I muted the TV and listened, but all I could hear was the usual mountain sounds. Wind through the pines, maybe an owl somewhere in the distance. Buster kept staring at the door though, his whole body tense like he was ready to bolt. I figured maybe it was just a raccoon or something getting into the garbage cans, so I flipped the porch light on and looked out the window. Nothing there, just the empty yard and the tree line beyond. But Buster wouldn't settle down, kept pacing between me and the door, whining softly under his breath. Around midnight I heard it. Footsteps, not the random cracking of branches or leaves rustling. Deliberate, measured steps somewhere outside my bedroom window. I was already half awake because Buster had been restless all evening, getting up and lying back down every few minutes. The sound was soft but distinct, like someone trying to walk quietly but not quite managing it. Crunch, pause, moving slow and careful around the side of the cabin. I lay there listening, trying to convince myself it was just a deer or maybe a bear, but the rhythm was all wrong. Too steady, too purposeful. Buster was now standing at the foot of my bed, his fur standing up along his spine, staring toward the window. I could see his silhouette in the dim light from my alarm clock, every muscle in his body coiled tight. The footsteps continued for maybe 2 minutes, circling from the bedroom window toward the back of the cabin, then just stopped. Complete silence except for my own breathing and Buster's soft panting. I waited about 20 minutes before I worked up the nerve to get out of bed and check the windows. Grabbed my old mag light from the nightstand and crept to the bedroom window first, keeping low and peering out through the corner of the blinds. The motion sensor light I'd installed back there should have kicked on if anything bigger than a cat walked by, but it was dark. I moved through the cabin room by room, checking every window, but didn't see anything unusual. The yard looked normal, the tree line was still, and there was no movement anywhere. But when I got to the kitchen window that faces the back of the property, I noticed something that made my chest tighten. There was a clear path pressed into the tall grass that runs along the back edge of my property line, like someone had walked back and forth along it multiple times. The grass was bent down in a line maybe 2 feet wide, running parallel to the cabin about 30 yards out. I'd been living there for almost 2 years and had never seen anything like that. The path was too straight and too deliberate to be from animals, and it definitely wasn't there when I'd been out back earlier that day working on the wood pile. The next morning, I walked out to get a closer look at that path in the grass. In the daylight, it was even more obvious, a worn track that ran along the entire back edge of my property, maybe 100 yards long. The grass wasn't just bent, it was actually worn down in places, like someone had been walking this route regularly for a while. What really got to me was finding a couple of cigarette butts along the path, The kind with filters, not the hand-rolled ones you might expect from some old-timer living off the grid. These were fresh too, maybe a day or two old at most. I also found what looked like heel prints in a muddy spot near the corner of the property. Size 10 or 11 work boots from the look of them. I took some pictures with my phone and spent the rest of the morning walking the entire perimeter of my land, looking for anything else out of place. Found a couple more cigarette butts near the front edge of the property, and what might have been a boot print by the mailbox. The whole thing felt like someone had been watching the cabin, learning my routines, maybe planning something. That evening, I made sure all the doors and windows were locked tight and kept a baseball bat by my bed. Buster seemed more relaxed during the day, but as soon as the sun went down, he started that same restless behavior from the night before. Around 11 o'clock, I heard them again, those deliberate footsteps, this time coming from the front of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and the bat and went to the living room window. The footsteps were louder now, more confident, like whoever it was didn't care as much about being quiet. I could hear them moving across the gravel driveway, then onto the wooden steps of the front porch. The porch boards creaked under the weight, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing each step. Buster was practically vibrating with tension, his lips pulled back in a silent snarl. I held my breath and listened as the footsteps moved across the porch, paused at the front door for what felt like forever, then continued around toward the side of the cabin. The motion lights should have been triggering, but they weren't. That's when I realized whoever this was had probably disabled them somehow. I decided I'd had enough. Grabbed my .38 from the gun safe and chambered around, then unlocked the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool and still, with just a sliver of moon giving off barely enough light to see the outline of the trees. I listened hard but couldn't hear anything now. No footsteps, no rustling, nothing. Called out in my loudest voice, "I know you're out there. This is private property and you need to leave right now." My voice echoed off the trees and seemed to hang in the air for a long time. No response. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, straining my ears and scanning the darkness, but it was like whoever had been there just vanished. The silence was almost worse than the footsteps had been. I went back inside and spent the rest of the night sitting in my recliner with the gun in my lap, dozing off and on but never really sleeping. Buster curled up right next to my chair, which he'd never done before, and kept lifting his head every few minutes to look toward the windows. The next morning I found the real evidence that changed everything. I'd been putting off checking the back of the cabin because, frankly, I was scared of what I might find. But the sunlight gave me enough courage to walk around the entire perimeter, looking for clues about what had been happening. When I got to the far back corner where the cabin sits closest to the tree line, I saw something that made my knees go weak. There were wires strung between two trees at exactly ankle height, maybe 6 inches off the ground. Not one or two, but 4 separate wire traps spread across about 20 feet of space, positioned perfectly to catch someone walking from the cabin toward the woods. The wires were wrapped around the trees and twisted tight, with enough slack to trip someone, but not enough to be visible unless you were looking for them. These weren't some random hunting snares. They were positioned specifically to catch someone coming from my back door. The twisted metal ends were sharp and jagged, designed to cut and tangle around your legs. If I'd walked out there in the dark like I'd been planning to do, I would have gone down hard and probably gotten sliced up pretty bad in the process. I stood there staring at those wires for a long time, trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't just someone creeping around my property. This was deliberate, calculated, and meant to hurt me. The positioning was too precise to be random. Whoever set these traps knew exactly where I'd be most likely to walk if I came out the back door investigating strange noises. They'd probably watched me enough to know my habits, maybe seen me take Buster out back for his evening walks. The thought that someone had been studying me, planning this whole thing, made me feel sick to my stomach. I carefully took pictures of each wire trap from different angles, then used my wire cutters to remove them all. The metal was fresh, probably put up within the last day or two. As I was cutting the last one, I noticed something else that made the whole situation even more disturbing. There were footprints in the soft dirt around the trees, but they were small, maybe a size 7 or 8 boot, not the larger prints I'd found by the mailbox. Either there were two people involved in this, or someone was deliberately trying to confuse me. That afternoon, I drove straight to the sheriff's office in town and filed a report. Deputy Johnson listened to my story and looked at the photos on my phone, but I could tell he was having trouble taking it seriously. He kept asking if I had any enemies, if I'd had any disputes with neighbors, if maybe I'd been drinking when I heard the footsteps. When I showed him the pictures of the wire traps, his attitude changed completely. He said he'd never seen anything like that in 20 years of police work, and that level of premeditation usually meant someone was planning something much worse than just harassment. He promised to have a patrol car swing by my place a few times over the next week, and told me to call immediately if I saw or heard anything else. But I could tell he thought this was probably just a one-time thing, maybe some kids playing a prank or someone with a grudge who'd gotten it out of their system. He had no idea how wrong he was. I spent the rest of the day at the hardware store, buying motion-activated cameras, better locks, and a floodlight system that would light up the entire perimeter of my property. If someone was going to come back, I wanted to be ready for them. I spent the entire next week installing my new security system and barely slept more than a few hours at a time. The cameras were positioned to cover every angle around the cabin, and the floodlights would turn the whole area bright as day if anything bigger than a squirrel moved out there. For 3 nights, everything was quiet. No footsteps, no strange behavior from Buster, nothing. I started to think maybe whoever it was had moved on or gotten scared off by my confrontation that night. But on the 4th night, around 2 a.m., every single floodlight around my cabin blazed to life at once. I grabbed my gun and ran to the window, expecting to see someone caught in the lights. Instead, I saw something that made me realize just how serious this situation had become. Every single camera I'd installed had been destroyed. Not just unplugged or knocked down, but completely smashed with what looked like a sledgehammer. The motion sensors for the lights had been disabled too, but not before capturing whoever did it on the one camera they'd missed. A trail cam I'd hidden in a tree about 50 yards out. When I checked the footage the next morning, I saw a figure in dark clothing and a ski mask systematically destroying my security system with methodical precision. They knew exactly where everything was positioned, like they'd been watching me install it all week. But here's the thing that really terrified me. In the final seconds of footage before that camera got destroyed too, the figure looked directly at it and waved. That same morning, I called Deputy Johnson and told him I was packing up and leaving. He tried to convince me to stay, said they'd increase patrols and maybe set up a surveillance operation, but I'd had enough. Whoever this was had escalated from harassment to property destruction, and I wasn't going to wait around to see what came next. I spent 2 days packing up my essentials and arranging to rent a place in town while I figured out what to do with the cabin. On my last night there, I sat on the porch with Buster and my .38, just waiting to see if they'd show up one final time. Around midnight I heard them, those same deliberate footsteps, but this time they came right up to the edge of the porch. I couldn't see anyone in the darkness, but I could feel them there, maybe 10 feet away, just standing and watching. I called out that I was leaving and wouldn't be back, that they'd won and could have the place. The footsteps moved away slowly, and I never heard them again. I sold the cabin 6 months later to a family from Atlanta, who turned it into a vacation rental. Far as I know, they've never had any problems, but I sometimes wonder if whoever was stalking me is still out there in those mountains, waiting for the right target to come along. We were staying in North Carolina that summer, not far from the Blue Ridge Parkway. My parents had rented this little cabin for a week. No Wi-Fi, barely any signal, but surrounded by trees and trails that my dad wouldn't stop calling refreshing. I had just turned 16 and wasn't thrilled about being pulled away from my friends for a family bonding trip, but I'd packed my sketchbook, earbuds, and a backup battery. I figured I could survive a few days of trail mix and mosquito bites. That morning we'd set out early for a popular overlook trail. It was foggy but beautiful. That soft bluish mist hanging low between the trees, the kind that makes everything feel a bit enchanted. The trail itself was well marked and easy to follow, but I had stopped a few times to take photos and sketch some tree roots that looked like they were gripping the earth like hands. At some point, I realized I couldn't hear my parents' voices anymore. I figured they'd just kept walking and I'd catch up, so I took the next bend in the trail without thinking twice. Except the bend didn't lead to them. It opened up into a split I didn't remember seeing before. One path sloped down slightly, the other kept going uphill. I called out, "Nothing." I took the uphill route thinking I'd meet them at the top. But after 10 minutes, the trees thickened and the fog got heavier. I couldn't hear birds anymore, just the crunch of my own steps. I was trying not to panic, but my chest felt tight and I kept glancing behind me, like I expected to see something that didn't belong there. That's when I heard someone call out, "Hey, are you lost?" The voice was calm and close. A boy around my age stood a few feet off the trail, wearing a faded red hoodie and cargo shorts. His hair was light brown and kind of messy, and he had a small scar on his chin that caught the light when he turned. Something about him felt oddly familiar, like a face from a dream you only half remember. I said I was trying to get back to the parking lot, and he smiled like it was no big deal. "I know the way. Come on, it's easy." And without waiting, he turned and started walking. I hesitated for a second, but the way he moved was so casual, so sure of where he was going, that I followed. He didn't talk much, just glanced back every now and then to make sure I was still behind him. The fog seemed to lift a little as we walked, and the trees felt less dense. I tried to make conversation, asked his name, and he said, "Eli." He didn't offer more than that. When I asked if he came here often, he just said, "I used to." I figured maybe he lived nearby or had family who visited the area a lot. His voice had this soft, steady rhythm to it, like someone who didn't rush to speak. The weird thing was, the trail he led me through didn't look familiar at all. I thought I knew most of the loops from the map we'd studied at the ranger station, but this one felt quieter, older. The trees were taller here, and I noticed carvings in one of them, initials, dates, faded with age. Eli touched one as we passed and said, "That one's mine." I asked what he meant, but he just shrugged like it wasn't important. We crossed a wooden footbridge that creaked under our steps and passed a collapsed stone wall, half swallowed by vines. None of this had been on the trail earlier. Still, after about 20 minutes, I saw the parking lot up ahead, the line of cars just barely visible through the trees. Relief hit me hard. I turned to thank him, but he was already stepping back toward the woods. "You'll be fine now," he said, then gave a small wave and turned around. I wanted to ask if he needed a ride or if he wanted to come with me, but I didn't. I watched him walk until he was just a blur between the trees. By the time I reached the lot, I spotted my dad near our car, frantically scanning the trail entrance. He looked like he was about to yell, then pulled me into one of those tight, wordless hugs. My mom came running right after, saying they'd been looking everywhere and were about to call for help. I told them I'd gotten turned around but found someone named Eli who helped me back. They asked if he was a ranger or another hiker, but I just said he was a kid, around my age. My dad squinted toward the woods and asked where he was. I pointed back, but of course Eli wasn't there anymore. The trail behind me looked empty. Back at the ranger station, my parents insisted we stop in to let someone know I'd gotten turned around. They were worried there might be signage missing or something wrong with the trail layout. While my dad talked to the older ranger behind the desk, I wandered over to a faded bulletin board covered in trail maps and old laminated notices. There was a section titled "In Memory," with a few photos of people who died in the park. I wasn't really paying attention until one of the names hit me like a punch to the chest. Eli Chambers. His photo was maybe 10 years old, but the face was unmistakable. Same light brown hair, same scar on the chin. The caption below said he'd slipped and fallen near one of the overlooks during a hike. The year was 2011. I stared at it for what felt like forever. When I told my parents, they brushed it off as coincidence. They said I probably heard the name from the board, and my mind filled in the rest, especially with all the stress. But I hadn't seen that photo before. I hadn't even been near the board until that moment. The ranger must have overheard me talking because he came over quietly and asked what trail I'd been on. When I told him, his face changed. It wasn't dramatic or theatrical. He just went pale in a subtle, tired way, like someone who'd heard something they were hoping they wouldn't hear again. He asked what the boy looked like, and when I described Eli, he nodded slowly, almost like he expected it. Then he said, carefully, "You're not the first one to say something like that." My parents looked uncomfortable, like they didn't know if this was a joke or not, but the ranger didn't smile. It's been a few years since that day. I've gone on a few hikes since then, but nothing deep. Nothing where I might get turned around again. I think about Eli sometimes, how calm he was, how familiar the trail felt when I followed him, how confidently he walked. I don't pretend to know what really happened. Maybe it was stress, maybe memory playing tricks, but I know what I saw. I know who helped me. And whoever he was, or whatever he was, he knew exactly where I needed to go. You know how some experiences just stick with you, no matter how much time passes? What happened to me and my daughter Lily during our camping trip last spring is one of those memories that refuses to fade. I'm a single dad, been raising Lily on my own since she was 7, and she's 15 now. We'd been planning this father-daughter camping trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains for months. I work as a mechanical engineer at a small firm in Virginia, and between my crazy schedule and her school activities, we barely got quality time together anymore. The trip was supposed to be our chance to reconnect, just the two of us hiking the trails we'd explored when she was younger. I remember packing our old Coleman tent, the one with the patch on the side from when she accidentally tore it with a marshmallow stick 3 years ago. Everything seemed perfect as we loaded my Ford Explorer that Friday morning in May, with Lily actually excited instead of buried in her phone for once. The campsite we'd reserved was about 2 miles up the Appalachian Trail, nestled in a clearing surrounded by towering oak trees that filtered the sunlight into these beautiful golden patches. We'd hiked this particular section before, but never camped overnight. Lily had grown so much since our last trip here. She was keeping up with my pace easily now, chatting about her friends and complaining about her math teacher, Mr. Peterson, who apparently gave impossible tests. The weather was absolutely perfect, probably around 70 degrees with a light breeze that carried the scent of wildflowers and pine needles. We set up camp around 3 p.m., and I taught her how to properly stake down the rainfly, something I'd been meaning to show her for ages. She was actually paying attention, asking good questions about why we needed to angle the stakes a certain way. After we finished, we cooked hot dogs over our portable camp stove and shared a bag of trail mix while watching the sun start to dip behind the mountain ridges. For the first time in months, I felt like I had my little girl back, even though she kept reminding me she wasn't little anymore. Around 6 p.m., we were sitting on a fallen log about 50 feet from our tent, playing 20 questions and watching for wildlife, when this guy just appeared on the trail. I mean, he literally seemed to materialize out of nowhere. 1 second we were alone, the next second there he was, maybe 30 yards away, walking toward us with this strange, uneven gait. He looked to be in his 40s, average height, wearing a faded green flannel shirt that was way too warm for the weather, and jeans that were absolutely filthy, like he'd been rolling around in the dirt. His hair was dark and greasy, hanging in clumps around his face, and he had this patchy beard that looked like it hadn't been trimmed in weeks. But what really caught my attention were his eyes. They had this glassy, unfocused quality, like he was looking through us rather than at us. He was carrying a small backpack that looked practically empty, and his boots were caked with mud that seemed fresh, which was weird because it hadn't rained in days. As he got closer, I noticed he was breathing heavily, like he'd been running or hiking at an intense pace for a long time. "Excuse me," he called out when he was about 10 feet away, his voice hoarse and scratchy. "I'm really sorry to bother you folks, but I'm wondering if you might have any water to spare." There was something about the way he said it that made me uncomfortable, not the request itself, which was perfectly reasonable, but the way his eyes kept darting around our campsite. taking inventory of everything we had. Lily instinctively moved closer to me, and I could feel her tense up beside me. The man's clothes reeked of sweat and something else I couldn't quite identify. Maybe unwashed wool or damp earth. His fingernails were caked with dirt, and there were these red scratches all over his forearms, like he'd been pushing through thick brush. I've been hiking for, well, I'm not really sure how long, he continued, running a dirty hand through his hair. I think I might have taken a wrong turn somewhere back there. He gestured vaguely toward the trail behind him, but his movement was jerky and uncoordinated, like he wasn't quite sure where he was pointing. The whole interaction felt surreal, like we were talking to someone who wasn't completely present in the moment. Of course, I couldn't just turn the guy away. My dad raised me to help people when they needed it, and refusing someone water in the wilderness seemed downright cruel. Sure, no problem, I said, getting up from the log and walking toward our tent where we kept our water supply. Lily stayed put, watching the stranger with obvious unease. I grabbed one of our extra water bottles, a blue Nalgene that was about 3/4 full, and handed it to him. The guy took it with both hands, like it was the most precious thing in the world, and immediately started gulping it down with desperate, noisy swallows. Water dribbled down his chin and onto his shirt, and he didn't seem to care at all. "Thank you so much," he said between gulps. "You have no idea how much this means to me." But here's the thing that really bothered me. While he was drinking, his eyes kept scanning our campsite, lingering on our tent, our backpacks, the cooler where we kept our food. It wasn't casual curiosity. It was like he was memorizing the layout, cataloging everything we had. When he finished drinking, he held onto the bottle for a moment too long, turning it in his hands like he was considering keeping it. "Are you camping nearby?" I asked, trying to sound friendly while also gathering information. Something about this whole situation was making my parental instincts go haywire. The guy looked at me with those unfocused eyes and shook his head slowly. No, I'm just trying to get back to my car," he said, but his voice trailed off like he wasn't sure that was true. "I parked somewhere down the mountain, but everything looks different now. The trails, they're not where I remember them being." He handed me back the empty bottle, and his fingers were ice cold despite the warm weather. "You folks seem like you know what you're doing out here." "Been camping long?" The question seemed innocent enough, but the way he asked it with that intense stare made me want to end this conversation quickly. Lily hadn't said a word the entire time, which wasn't like her at all. She was usually pretty social, even with strangers, but she was sitting rigidly on that log, watching this guy like he was a wild animal that might bolt at any second. "Just got here today," I answered, deliberately vague. "Planning to head out tomorrow morning." I wasn't sure why I lied about our departure time. We were actually planning to stay another night, but some instinct told me not to give him our real schedule. The stranger nodded slowly, but I could tell he was processing what I'd said, maybe filing it away for later. "Tomorrow morning, that's good," he said, and there was something in his tone that made my skin crawl. "It's not safe to stay out here too long. People go missing in these mountains." He said it so casually, like he was commenting on the weather, but the words hung in the air between us like a threat. Lily's eyes went wide, and she finally spoke up. "Dad, we should probably start getting dinner ready." Smart girl. She was giving us an excuse to end this conversation. The man's head snapped toward her voice, and for just a second, his expression changed. The glassy, confused look was replaced by something much more alert and calculating. "Pretty daughter you got there," he said, and the way he said it made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. "She's got good instincts. You should listen to her." He shouldered his nearly empty backpack and started backing away from our campsite, but he kept his eyes on us the whole time. "Thanks again for the water. Maybe I'll see you folks around." Then he turned and walked back down the trail, but not in the direction he'd come from originally. He headed toward the deeper part of the forest, where the trail split into several smaller paths that led to more remote camping areas. We watched him disappear into the trees, and I felt this overwhelming urge to pack up everything and leave immediately. But it was getting dark, and hiking down the mountain in the dark with Lily would be dangerous. "Dad, that guy was really weird," Lily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you see how he kept looking at our stuff, and the way he stared at me when I talked?" I had seen it, and it made me sick to my stomach. "Yeah, sweetheart, I noticed that too. But he's gone now, and we're going to be fine." I tried to sound confident, but honestly, I was already running through contingency plans in my head. We spent the rest of the evening trying to act normal, cooking our dinner and talking about school and her friends. But I could tell we were both on edge. Every sound from the forest, every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, made us both jump. I kept glancing toward the trail, half expecting to see that guy emerge from the shadows. When it came time to set up for the night, I made sure our tent was zipped up tight and positioned myself between Lily and the tent opening. I had my phone, but there was no signal up here, which meant we were completely on our own until morning. As we settled into our sleeping bags, I told Lily I loved her and that everything would be okay. But I don't think either of us really believed it. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps circling our tent. Not animal footsteps. These were deliberate human footsteps moving slowly and carefully around our campsite. My heart started pounding so hard I was sure Lily would hear it, but she was still asleep beside me, breathing deeply. The footsteps stopped right outside our tent, maybe 3 feet from where we were lying, and I held my breath trying to figure out what to do. Then I heard it. A metallic scraping sound, like something hard being dragged across a rock. The sound moved in a slow arc around our tent, and I realized with horror that someone was deliberately circling us, dragging some kind of metal object along the ground. The scraping was rhythmic and purposeful, like whoever was out there wanted us to know they were there. I reached for my phone, hoping against hope that I might have gotten a signal, but the screen showed nothing but no service in the corner. The footsteps and scraping continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. Then everything went quiet, and somehow that silence was even more terrifying than the sounds had been. I lay there, perfectly still, straining my ears for any hint of movement, but all I could hear was the normal forest sounds: crickets, wind through the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. I must have dozed off eventually because the next thing I knew, sunlight was filtering through the tent fabric and Lily was shaking me awake. "Dad, there's something outside," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. I unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out, and what I saw made my heart sink. There were gouges in the dirt all around our tent, deep scratches that formed a perfect circle, like someone had used a crowbar or similar tool to mark the ground. The scratches were fresh, maybe an inch deep, and they went all the way around our campsite. Near the fire pit, I spotted something that made my blood run cold: muddy boot prints that matched the ones I'd seen on the stranger's feet the day before. But these prints were everywhere, crisscrossing our campsite like he'd been walking around freely while we slept. Some of the prints were right next to our tent, so close that he could have reached out and touched the fabric. I counted at least 20 different prints, which meant he'd been out there for a long time, probably watching us sleep. The worst part was finding what looked like a makeshift shelter about 50 yards into the woods, a lean-to made from branches and leaves that hadn't been there when we'd arrived. Someone had been camping within sight of us, and we'd had no idea. We packed up our campsite in record time, both of us barely speaking as we stuffed everything into our backpacks. Lily kept glancing toward the makeshift shelter in the woods, and I could see the fear in her eyes. The hike down the mountain felt like it took forever, even though we were moving faster than we ever had before. Every time we heard a sound behind us, we'd both turn around, expecting to see that strange man following us down the trail. When we finally reached the parking area, I was so relieved to see other people. A family loading their car after their own camping trip, a couple of day hikers checking their map. Normal people doing normal things. We threw our gear into the Explorer and got out of there as fast as we could. The drive home was quiet, both of us processing what had happened. About an hour into the drive, I decided we needed to report this to someone, so I stopped at a state police station in a small town called Millerville. The officer who took our statement was a middle-aged guy named Sergeant Williams, and when I described the man we'd encountered, his expression became very serious. He started asking detailed questions about the man's appearance, what he was wearing, the exact time we'd seen him. Sergeant Williams disappeared into a back room for about 10 minutes, then returned with a file folder and a grave expression. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "I think you and your daughter encountered someone we've been looking for. We've had 2 hikers reported missing in that area since Saturday. A couple from Pennsylvania named Kevin and Beth Turner. They were supposed to check out of their campsite Sunday morning, but they never showed up." He showed me their photos and my stomach dropped. They looked like a normal, happy couple, probably in their 30s, both wearing bright hiking gear and smiling at the camera. "We found their abandoned campsite yesterday, about 3 miles from where you were staying. Their tent was still set up, but all their personal belongings were gone. We also found evidence of someone else having been at their site, boot prints that didn't match theirs, and signs that someone had been watching them from the woods." The officer explained that they'd been searching for the missing hikers, but they'd also been looking for a man matching the description of our water-seeking stranger. Apparently, he'd been spotted by other campers in the area over the past few weeks, always asking for help, always seeming disoriented, always disappearing back into the forest. They suspected he was living rough in the mountains, possibly suffering from mental illness or drug addiction. "The crowbar scratches around our tent," Williams said, "were likely his way of marking territory or sending a message." The good news was that our report gave them enough information to intensify their search efforts, and within a week, they'd found both the man and, tragically, evidence of what had happened to the missing hikers. I never got all the details, but I know the man was arrested and the case was closed. Lily and I never went back to those mountains, and to this day she won't go camping anywhere without cell phone service. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed that second night like we'd originally planned, but honestly, I'm just grateful we made it home safely. What happened to me last summer still haunts me whenever I pass by hiking gear stores or see trail maps. I was 28 at the time, a software engineer from Chicago who'd been planning this solo hiking trip along the Appalachian Trail for months. The whole thing was meant to be my escape from the corporate grind and a chance to find some peace in nature. I'd been training for weeks, researching trail conditions and mapping out shelter locations with obsessive detail. This was supposed to be therapeutic, just me, my backpack, and the wilderness stretching ahead. I'd done plenty of day hikes before, but this was my first multi-day solo adventure, and I was honestly pretty excited about proving to myself that I could handle it. The anticipation had been building for months, and I felt ready for anything the trail might throw at me, or at least, that's what I thought. The day started off perfect. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and a gentle breeze that made the miles feel effortless. I'd been hiking for about 6 hours when I reached this small town near the trail, and I decided to grab some supplies and maybe a hot meal before heading to my planned shelter for the night. The local diner was one of those classic small-town places with checkered tablecloths and a waitress who called everyone Hun. While I was finishing my coffee, this older guy at the counter, must have been in his 70s, weathered face with deep lines around his eyes, overheard me talking about my hiking plans. He turned around slowly, gave me this serious look, and said something that should have been a red flag. "Whatever you do, don't sleep at Whisper Ridge Shelter tonight." His voice was low and urgent, like he was sharing some kind of secret. Naturally, I asked him why, but he just shook his head and muttered something about, "Bad things happen there," before turning back to his pie. The waitress, who'd been eavesdropping, rolled her eyes and said the old man was just being dramatic. She explained that Whisper Ridge was perfectly safe, just an old 3-sided wooden shelter about 2 miles up the trail, same as dozens of others along the route. When I pressed the old guy for more details, he just kept repeating that I should find somewhere else to sleep, anywhere else. The whole interaction lasted maybe 5 minutes, but there was something in his eyes that made my stomach twist a little. Still, I'd already planned my route, and the next shelter was another 8 miles away. I was tired. My feet were sore. And honestly, I thought he was just some superstitious local trying to spook the city boy. The rational part of my brain dismissed his warning as small-town folklore. The hike to Whisper Ridge took me through some of the most beautiful forest I'd ever seen. Towering oak trees formed a natural cathedral above the trail, and shafts of golden afternoon light filtered through the leaves in a way that made everything look almost magical. I remember thinking how peaceful it all was, how this was exactly what I'd been hoping for when I planned the trip. The shelter itself was pretty standard, a 3-sided wooden structure with a corrugated metal roof, positioned in a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a fire ring out front, and a wooden table that looked like it had seen better days. The whole place had that musty outdoorsy smell that comes from years of hikers passing through. I dropped my pack on the wooden sleeping platform and started setting up my gear, feeling pretty satisfied with my choice to ignore the old man's warning. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, and I felt completely at peace with the world. I spent the evening doing typical hiker stuff, cooking a simple dinner on my camp stove, writing in my trail journal, and watching the stars emerge as darkness settled over the forest. The silence was incredible, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. Around 9 o'clock, I crawled into my sleeping bag and pulled out my headlamp to read for a while. The shelter felt solid and secure, and I was already planning tomorrow's route in my head. I must have dozed off around 10:30, book still in my lap, feeling more relaxed than I had in months. The temperature had dropped nicely, and a gentle breeze was coming through the open side of the shelter. Everything was perfect. Almost too perfect, if that makes sense. I should have remembered that the old man's warning wasn't about the shelter itself, but about what happens there after dark. The first whisper came around midnight, and at first, I thought it was just the wind moving through the trees. It was so faint that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it, just my brain playing tricks as I drifted between sleep and wakefulness. But then I heard it again. Definitely human voices, multiple people talking in hushed tones somewhere just beyond the back wall of the shelter. The sound was muffled but unmistakably real, like people having a conversation they didn't want to be overheard. My heart started beating faster, and I lay there completely still, straining to make out words or figure out how many people were out there. The voices seemed to be moving slowly around the perimeter of the shelter, never getting closer but never going away either. I kept telling myself it was probably just other hikers setting up a late camp, but something about the tone and the secretive nature of the whispering made my skin crawl. Every instinct I had was screaming that this wasn't normal. I grabbed my headlamp but didn't turn it on, instead just holding it like some kind of weapon while I listened. The whispering continued for what felt like hours, sometimes fading to almost nothing, then growing just loud enough for me to know it was still there. I could make out at least 2 distinct voices, maybe 3, but I couldn't understand a single word they were saying. It was like they were speaking in a different language, or maybe just too far away for the words to carry clearly. The strangest part was how the voices never seemed to move in any logical pattern. They'd be behind the shelter one moment, then off to the left, then right, like the speakers were just wandering aimlessly through the woods. I kept waiting for footsteps, for the sound of branches breaking or leaves crunching, but there was nothing except those constant, eerie whispers floating through the darkness. My rational mind kept trying to find explanations, but my body was responding to pure fear. As the night wore on, the whispers became more frequent and seemed to be getting closer to the shelter walls. I could hear them most clearly when they were directly behind me, separated only by the thin wooden planks of the back wall. At one point, I swear I heard what sounded like fingers tapping gently against the wood, just a light rhythmic tapping that lasted maybe 30 seconds before stopping. That's when I realized I was holding my breath, afraid that even the sound of my breathing might attract attention to where I was lying. The voices would fade away for 10 or 15 minutes, giving me hope that whatever was out there had moved on. But then they'd return, always in that same hushed, secretive tone. I must have checked my watch 100 times, counting down the hours until sunrise and praying that daylight would bring an end to this nightmare. The worst part was not knowing who or what was out there, or why they were circling my shelter like predators stalking prey. Around 3 in the morning, the whispers suddenly stopped completely. The silence was almost worse than the voices had been, because now I had no way of knowing where they were or what they were doing. I lay there in the darkness, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something to happen. My ears were so tuned to the slightest sound that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my head. Minutes passed, then an hour, and still nothing. I started to think maybe they'd finally moved on, whoever they were. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving around the outside of the shelter. These weren't the light steps of someone trying to be quiet. They were heavy, purposeful, like someone who wanted me to know they were there. The steps circled the shelter once, twice, then stopped directly in front of the open entrance. I could see nothing but darkness, but I knew someone was standing there, watching me. The footsteps moved away after what felt like an eternity, and gradually the normal sounds of the forest returned. Crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, the gentle rustling of leaves. But I didn't sleep another minute that night. I lay there clutching my headlamp, watching the entrance of the shelter and listening for any sign that the whispers might return. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound made me jump. When the first pale light of dawn finally started filtering through the trees, I've never been so relieved to see the sunrise in my entire life. I packed up my gear in record time, not even bothering to make coffee or eat breakfast. All I wanted was to get away from that place and back to civilization. As I shouldered my pack and stepped out of the shelter, I took one last look around the clearing, and I swear I could still feel eyes watching me from somewhere in the dark woods. The peaceful forest from the day before now felt menacing and hostile, like it was hiding secrets I didn't want to know. I practically ran down the trail, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Whisper Ridge. When I finally made it back to that same diner where I'd stopped the day before, I was exhausted, paranoid, and probably looked like I'd seen a ghost. The same waitress was working, and she took one look at me and asked if I was okay. When I told her about the whispers and the footsteps, her face went pale. She disappeared into the kitchen and came back with the old man from the day before. Turns out he was her father and helped run the place. He sat down across from me, his weathered face grave, and told me what I should have learned before I ignored his warning. About 15 years ago, a hiker named Jake Mitchell had been murdered at that exact shelter. He'd been stabbed multiple times while he slept, and his killer had never been caught. The old man said locals had been reporting strange sounds and voices around the shelter ever since, especially on nights when solo hikers stayed there. He looked me straight in the eye and said, "That's why we try to warn people. Some places just aren't meant for the living anymore." I finished my coffee in silence, paid my bill, and drove straight home to Chicago. I never completed that hiking trip, and I haven't been back to any remote trail since. The rational part of my mind wants to believe it was just my imagination, maybe some locals playing pranks, or even just the stress of sleeping alone in an unfamiliar place. But deep down I know what I heard that night was real. Those whispers, those footsteps, that presence watching me from the darkness. It was all connected to what happened to Jake Mitchell 15 years ago. Whether it was his spirit trying to warn me, or something darker that had been drawn to that place by the violence, I'll never know. What I do know is that I should have listened to the old man's warning. Some advice, no matter how strange it sounds, is worth taking seriously. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking I can hear those whispers just beyond my bedroom wall, and I have to remind myself that I'm hundreds of miles away from Whisper Ridge, but the memory of that night will never leave me. The weekend was supposed to be perfect. I was 17, about to graduate from Pine Ridge High, and thought I had everything figured out. We'd driven up to Copper Mountain for our annual senior camping trip, 12 of us crammed into 3 cars, loaded with enough supplies to last the weekend. The place was this sprawling wilderness area about 2 hours north of town, known for its pristine lakes and hiking trails that seemed to stretch forever into the forest. I'd been coming here since I was a kid with my family, so I knew the area better than most. The others were content to sit around the fire, drinking beer they'd somehow managed to sneak past the park rangers. But I'd always been the type who needed to move, to explore, to find something new. My friends called me restless, but I preferred to think of myself as adventurous. Saturday afternoon was when everything started to unravel. The sun was hanging low in the sky, casting these long shadows through the pine trees that made everything look like a postcard. Most of the group had settled in for the day. Some were napping in their tents, others were playing cards on a makeshift table made from a cooler and some boards. I'd been sitting with them for maybe an hour, trying to get into the lazy weekend vibe, but my mind kept wandering to Crystal Lake. Was this hidden gem about 3 miles up the mountain trail, tucked away behind a ridge where most tourists never bothered to venture. My dad had taken me there when I was 14, and I'd never forgotten how the water was so clear you could see straight to the bottom, even in the deepest parts. The trail was well marked but challenging, winding through dense forest and over rocky outcroppings that required some serious scrambling. Around 4:30, I made the decision that would change everything. I announced to the group that I was going for a hike, maybe catch the sunset from higher up. Most of them barely looked up from their cards, except for my best friend Jessica, who gave me this concerned look. She had shoulder-length auburn hair and these piercing green eyes that always seemed to see right through people's bullshit. "Are you sure about going alone?" she asked, her voice carrying that protective tone she used when she thought I was being reckless. "It's getting kind of late, and those trails can be tricky in the dark." I waved her off, probably a little too dismissively, and told her I'd be back before full dark. I grabbed my phone, a water bottle, and my dad's old hiking boots, the ones with the distinctive red laces that had gotten me through countless adventures. The confidence I felt in that moment was almost intoxicating. The first mile of the trail was exactly as I remembered, a gentle incline through a corridor of towering pines, their needles creating a soft carpet underfoot that muffled every step. I'd always loved this part of the hike because it felt like walking through a natural cathedral, with shafts of golden sunlight filtering down through the canopy in these perfect dust-filled beams. The air was crisp and clean, carrying that distinctive mountain scent of pine resin and damp earth. I passed a few familiar landmarks, the lightning-struck oak that had been split clean in half, the boulder formation that looked like a sleeping giant, the small creek that bubbled over smooth stones worn glass-smooth by decades of flowing water. Everything was exactly as it should be, peaceful and familiar. About halfway through the second mile, I decided to take a selfie to send to Jessica, partly to prove I was fine, and partly because the lighting was absolutely perfect. I held my phone up at arm's length, angling it to catch both my face and the spectacular view behind me. The trail curved around a steep drop-off at that point, offering this incredible vista of the valley below and the mountain peaks stretching into the distance. I took maybe 5 or 6 shots, trying to get the perfect angle, adjusting my position slightly each time. The last photo turned out great. I was smiling genuinely, my dark hair catching the light, with this breathtaking backdrop of wilderness that looked like something out of a nature magazine. I typed a quick message to Jessica. "See? Totally fine up here. The view is incredible," and hit send. The message went through immediately, showing those little blue check marks that meant it had been delivered and read. I tucked my phone back into my jacket pocket and continued up the trail, feeling proud of myself for making the climb and excited about reaching the lake before sunset. The next section of trail was where things started to shift, though I didn't realize it at the time. The path became steeper and more winding, snaking back and forth across the mountainside in tight switchbacks that made my calves burn with each step. The forest began to change too. The tall pines gave way to shorter, scrubby trees and rocky outcroppings that jutted out at odd angles. I had to use my hands to steady myself on some of the rougher sections, gripping onto roots and rocks that had been worn smooth by countless other hikers. The silence was different here, more complete somehow. as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Even the usual forest sounds, bird calls, rustling leaves, distant water, seemed muted and far away. I kept checking my phone for the time, wanting to make sure I'd have enough daylight for the return trip, but the screen kept showing that weird no service message even though I'd had full bars just minutes before. About 20 minutes into this steeper section, I started getting that prickly sensation on the back of my neck, the kind that makes you want to turn around and check if someone's watching you. At first, I dismissed it as just nerves from being alone in the wilderness, but the feeling kept growing stronger with each step. The trail had become narrower here, barely wide enough for one person, with thick undergrowth pressing in on both sides. I found myself glancing back more frequently, scanning the path behind me for any sign of movement. There was nothing there, just the empty trail disappearing around the last bend. But the sensation persisted. It was like that moment in horror movies when you know something's wrong but you can't quite put your finger on what it is. I tried to shake it off by focusing on the physical challenge of the climb, counting my steps and breathing steadily, but every few minutes I'd catch myself looking back again. The strangest part was how the forest seemed to be reacting to my presence. Small animals that should have been darting away from my footsteps were nowhere to be seen. Even the insects had gone quiet. No buzzing, no chirping, nothing. The only sounds were my own breathing and the soft crunch of my boots on the rocky path. I'd been hiking these mountains for years and had never experienced anything like this eerie stillness. It was as if every living thing in the forest had suddenly decided to hide, leaving me completely alone on the mountainside. When I stopped to take a drink from my water bottle, the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. I stood there for a moment listening intently, straining to hear anything that might explain the weird atmosphere. That's when I heard it. A single snap of a branch, somewhere behind me on the trail. I turned around slowly, my eyes scanning the path I'd just traveled. The trail curved away behind a cluster of large boulders, making it impossible to see very far back. For several long seconds, I stood perfectly still, waiting to see if the sound would repeat. Nothing. Just that oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. I told myself it was probably just a deer or maybe a squirrel, but deep down I knew that didn't make sense. All the wildlife had vanished, remember? I called out, "Hello?" in a voice that sounded weaker than I'd intended, the word seeming to get swallowed up by the trees before it could travel very far. No response. I waited another minute, then decided to keep moving. The lake couldn't be much further now, and I was determined to reach it before the sun disappeared completely. But as I resumed climbing, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me, staying just out of sight, matching my pace step for step. The final stretch of trail was the most challenging part, a steep scramble up a rocky face that required all my concentration. I had to put both hands on the rock and essentially climb rather than walk, finding footholds in the crevices and pulling myself up section by section. It was exhausting work, and sweat was dripping into my eyes despite the cool mountain air. About halfway up this last climb, I paused to catch my breath and made the mistake of looking back down the way I'd come. What I saw made my heart race in a way that had nothing to do with the physical exertion. There, maybe 50 yards down the trail, was a figure standing motionless among the trees. It was too far away and too shadowy to make out any details, but it was definitely human-shaped and definitely watching me. The figure was partially obscured by the branches, but I could tell it was tall and wearing dark clothing. Most unsettling of all, it seemed to be perfectly still, not moving at all, just standing there like a statue. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the altitude and exertion were playing tricks on my eyes. When I looked again, the figure was still there, unchanged. I called out again, louder this time. "Hey, are you okay?" My voice echoed off the rock faces around me, but there was no response from the figure below. It didn't wave, didn't call back, didn't even seem to acknowledge that I'd spoken. Pure panic started creeping up my throat, and I made a split-second decision that probably saved my life. Instead of continuing up toward the lake, I started climbing down as fast as I could, half sliding, half scrambling down the rocky slope. My plan was to confront whoever was following me, to demand answers, to take back control of the situation. But as I got closer to where I'd seen the figure, I realized with growing horror that there was no one there. No footprints in the soft earth, no disturbed vegetation, no sign that anyone had been standing in that spot at all. The panic hit me full force then, and I abandoned all thoughts of reaching the lake. I turned around and started running down the trail, my phone clutched in my hand, desperately trying to get a signal so I could call for help. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every rustling branch made me jump and look around wildly. I was running so fast that I almost missed the sound of my phone hitting the ground when it slipped from my sweaty palm. I heard it bounce once, twice, then slide off the edge of the trail and into the thick undergrowth below. I stopped and stared at the spot where it had disappeared, knowing I should climb down to retrieve it, but too terrified to leave the main path. Instead, I kept running, driven by a primal fear that I'd never experienced before. The last thing I remember clearly is reaching the familiar section of trail with the lightning-struck oak, feeling like I was finally getting close to safety. Then everything went black, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in a hospital bed with Jessica sitting beside me, her face streaked with tears. People always ask me why I don't go hiking anymore. Used to be my favorite thing in the world, especially with my brother Tyler. We'd hit the trails every weekend, sometimes driving hours just to find new spots nobody else knew about. Last August, we decided to tackle Mount Harrington, this massive peak about 3 hours north of our hometown in Vermont. I was 26 at the time, working a dead-end job at a warehouse, and Tyler was 24. Fresh out of college with his fancy business degree, but still living at home. We both needed an escape from the mundane routine that had swallowed our lives whole. The plan was simple: 2 days, 1 night camping, and enough distance between us and civilization to forget our problems for a while. The weather forecast looked perfect that Saturday morning when we loaded up Tyler's beat-up Ford Ranger with our gear. Clear skies, mid-70s, barely any wind. We'd been planning this trip for weeks, studying trail maps and reading reviews online. Mount Harrington wasn't exactly beginner-friendly, but we'd done plenty of challenging hikes before. Tyler was always the more adventurous one, constantly pushing us to try harder trails, go further off the beaten path. I was usually the voice of reason, the one who made sure we had enough water and didn't take unnecessary risks. We complemented each other perfectly, or at least that's what I thought until that day. By the time we reached the trailhead around noon, the parking area was nearly empty except for one other car with out-of-state plates. "Perfect," Tyler said, grinning as he shouldered his pack. "Just the way we like it." The first few hours went exactly as expected. We followed the main trail up through dense pine forest, stopping occasionally to check the map and take photos of the incredible views opening up below us. Tyler was in one of his talkative moods, going on about this girl he'd met at a coffee shop and his plans to finally move out of our parents' house. I was only half listening, mostly focused on the rhythm of my boots against the packed dirt and the way the afternoon sun filtered through the canopy above. Around 3 o'clock, we reached what the map called Eagle's Rest, a flat clearing about halfway to the summit. We decided to take a longer break, sharing a bag of trail mix and planning our route for the final push. That's when Tyler spotted something that wasn't on our map. About 50 yards to the east, barely visible through the trees, was what looked like a narrow ledge jutting out from the cliff face. Tyler's eyes lit up the way they always did when he found something new to explore. He pointed it out, already standing up and adjusting his pack straps. "Come on," he said. "Let's check it out before we head to the campsite." I hesitated, glancing at my watch and then at the thick clouds starting to gather on the horizon. We still had a couple hours of daylight left, but mountain weather could change fast, and I didn't like the idea of wandering off the marked trail this late in the day. But Tyler was already walking toward the trees, and I knew from experience that arguing with him when he got like this was pointless. "Fine," I said, grabbing my pack, "but just a quick look. We're not spending the night up there." Getting to the ledge was trickier than it looked. We had to push through thick underbrush and climb over fallen logs, following what might have been an old animal trail. Tyler went first, as usual, clearing branches and calling back warnings about loose rocks. The forest seemed to close in around us as we moved away from the main trail, the canopy getting thicker and the air cooler. After about 20 minutes of careful navigation, we finally emerged onto the ledge Tyler had spotted. It was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 15 feet wide and 30 feet long, with a sheer drop-off on one side that had to be at least 200 feet down. The view was absolutely breathtaking. You could see for miles across the valley, with the river snaking through the forest below like a silver ribbon. Tyler immediately walked to the edge, peering down into the depths while I stayed back. Never comfortable with heights like that. The ledge itself was covered in loose gravel and scattered with what looked like old camping gear. A few rusted tent stakes, some frayed rope, and the remains of a fire pit someone had built against the back wall. Tyler kicked at the ashes, which looked recent enough to still have some unburned wood fragments. "Somebody's been here recently," he said, crouching down to examine the setup more closely. I wasn't sure I liked that idea. The whole area had an abandoned feeling to it, like people had left in a hurry. There was something unsettling about the way the wind whistled through the rocks behind us, creating these low, hollow sounds that seemed to echo from somewhere deep inside the cliff. Tyler didn't seem bothered by any of it. He was already planning how we could set up our tent on the flat section, talking about how amazing the sunrise would be from this vantage point. I kept checking my watch as we explored the ledge, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. The clouds I'd noticed earlier were definitely getting thicker, and the temperature was starting to drop. We needed to get back to the main trail and find our designated campsite before it got too dark to navigate safely. But Tyler was in full exploration mode, poking around the back of the ledge where the cliff wall curved inward, forming a shallow alcove. He'd found some kind of opening back there, just a narrow crack in the rock that seemed to go deeper than expected. "Hey, check this out," he called, already pulling out his phone's flashlight. "I think this might be a cave or something." I walked over reluctantly, not thrilled about the idea of cave exploring without proper equipment. The opening was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through, and the beam from Tyler's phone disappeared into complete darkness after just a few feet. The wind picked up as we stood there, and I swear the sound coming from that crack changed. Instead of the hollow whistling we'd been hearing, it became something lower, more sustained, almost like moaning. Tyler must have heard it too because he stepped back from the opening, his phone light wavering slightly. "Probably just the wind hitting the rock at a weird angle," he said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. I suggested we head back to the main trail, but Tyler wanted to stay and investigate a little longer. The sun was getting dangerously low now, casting long shadows across the ledge that seemed to move and shift in ways that made my skin crawl. That's when we both heard it clearly for the first time, a sound that definitely wasn't wind. It was muffled and distant, but unmistakably human. Someone was screaming down there in the darkness below the cliff. We both rushed to the edge, Tyler shining his phone light down into the void while I cupped my hands around my mouth and shouted, "Hello, can you hear us? Are you hurt?" The screaming stopped immediately, like someone had hit a mute button. We waited in complete silence for what felt like an eternity, straining our ears for any response. Then it started again, but this time it sounded different, more desperate, more frantic. There were definitely multiple voices, maybe 3 or 4 people all crying out at once. The sound seemed to be coming from directly below us, but Tyler's light couldn't penetrate far enough into the darkness to see anything. I grabbed my own phone and added its beam to his, but even combined, we couldn't make out any details of what lay beneath the ledge. The screaming continued in waves, sometimes loud enough that I was sure other hikers miles away could hear it, sometimes fading to barely audible whispers. Tyler immediately started dialing 911, but of course we had no cell service up there. We were too far from any towers, surrounded by too much rock and forest. I tried my phone too, moving around the ledge to see if I could find even one bar, but nothing. The screaming was getting more intense now, taking on an almost rhythmic quality that sent chills down my spine. It didn't sound like people calling for help anymore. It sounded like something else entirely. Tyler was already packing up his gear, his face pale in the fading light. "We need to get back to the trail and find a ranger station," he said, his voice tight with urgency. "These people have been stuck down there for who knows how long." We hiked back through the forest faster than we'd ever moved before, branches tearing at our clothes as we pushed through the underbrush. Behind us, the screaming continued until we were too far away to hear it anymore. We practically ran down the main trail, our headlamps cutting through the growing darkness as we navigated roots and rocks at dangerous speeds. Tyler kept checking his phone every few minutes, desperate for any sign of signal. Finally, about a mile from the trailhead, we got 2 bars. Tyler immediately called 911 while I pulled out the trail map, trying to give the dispatcher our exact location. The whole conversation felt surreal, explaining that we'd heard multiple people screaming from somewhere below a cliff, that we couldn't see them but they sounded trapped, that we needed search and rescue teams immediately. The dispatcher was professional but clearly skeptical, asking us to repeat details multiple times, and confirming that we hadn't actually seen anyone. We gave them the coordinates as best we could, describing the off-trail ledge and the approximate location of the screaming. They promised to send teams out at first light, but explained that night rescue operations in that terrain were extremely dangerous and rarely successful. We spent that night in our car at the trailhead, neither of us able to sleep. Tyler kept talking about how we should have tried to rappel down somehow, that we'd abandoned people who were counting on us for help. I kept replaying the sound in my head, trying to convince myself it really had been human voices, and not some weird acoustic phenomenon. Around dawn, we watched 3 search and rescue vehicles arrive, followed by a helicopter that circled the area for hours. The ground team spent the entire day combing every inch of the cliff face below that ledge, using ropes and specialized equipment to access areas that seemed impossible to reach. Late that afternoon, one of the rangers approached our car with a grim expression. They'd found nothing, no people, no bodies, no evidence that anyone had ever been trapped down there. But then he said something that made my stomach turn. "You're not the first ones to report screaming from that exact spot," he told us quietly. "Happens about once a year, always around dusk, always the same description. We've never found anything, but we keep looking because, well, what else can you do?" Tyler and I drove home in complete silence, and neither of us has been hiking since. Sometimes I still wake up hearing those voices, wondering if we really did abandon someone that night, or if we stumbled onto something much worse than a simple rescue situation. I was spending a weekend alone hiking near the edge of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. It wasn't something I usually did solo, but I'd just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and I needed space to breathe, to think. I'd planned this route a few weeks in advance, double-checked the weather, packed my gear properly. Everything looked fine, until it didn't. Around mid-afternoon, thick clouds rolled in faster than I expected. Within minutes, the trail turned dark. The rain came in sideways, and thunder started rolling so close it sounded like the mountain itself was cracking open. The trail I was following had been on an older printed map, the kind you buy in gas stations, and I'd chosen it precisely because it was quieter than the popular routes. I hadn't seen a single person all day. By the time the lightning got close enough to make my pack buzz, I was drenched and panicking. I pulled out the map, trying to find a shortcut or anything resembling cover. That's when I noticed a faint marking labeled "Emergency Shelter," almost faded out in the crease of the page. No signage, no mileage, just a dot in the woods. It looked like it might be a 15 or 20-minute detour, maybe more in the mud, but I didn't care. I took the turn and started running. It felt like I was chasing a ghost. The trail was overgrown and narrow, snaking through dense trees with low branches that clawed at my jacket. Everything smelled like wet leaves and earth. Eventually, after nearly slipping twice on the slick rock, I saw it. A small rectangular structure half sunken into the hill, like the mountain had tried to reclaim it. Concrete walls, a rusted metal door with peeling paint, and one broken window patched with plywood. It looked abandoned, not exactly welcoming, but I was soaked to the bone and the storm was getting worse. I pushed the door open, it wasn't locked, and stepped inside. At first glance it seemed empty. A concrete floor, a bench built into one wall, a shelf with an old first aid kit, and a couple of folded wool blankets. The air inside was damp and smelled like mildew. But then I noticed a few things that didn't sit right. There was an open granola bar wrapper near the bench, not even soggy like someone had eaten it recently. A plastic bottle half full of water with no dust on it. And tucked into the corner, behind the bench, a shredded fleece jacket, bright red, with one sleeve almost torn clean off. I remember thinking, if this place hasn't been on maps for years, why does it look like someone was just here? I stood there dripping, eyes locked on that torn red sleeve. It wasn't just ripped, it looked like it had been yanked or caught on something sharp. There were faint smears of dirt on the collar too, or maybe something else, darker. I picked it up and felt a strange weight in my chest, like I'd interrupted something that wasn't meant to be seen. I tried to tell myself someone probably just left in a hurry, maybe a ranger or a hiker who got turned around. But nothing about it felt organized. The trash, the clothes, the silence. It felt like I'd walked into the middle of a story I wasn't supposed to read. I tried to distract myself by setting up in the driest corner of the room. I laid out my emergency blanket, changed into a spare pair of leggings and a hoodie, and pulled out a protein bar. I didn't have signal inside the shelter, but I checked my phone anyway out of habit. Nothing. I remember sitting there chewing, listening to the rain hammering the roof, thinking about how far I'd wandered from the main trail. The longer I sat in that concrete box, the more aware I became of every sound. Drips, wind slipping through cracks, a groan from the old roof when the wind picked up. It all started to blend together into this low, humming pressure behind my ears. I got up to explore the room a little more. It wasn't big, maybe 12 by 12 feet, and most of it was bare. But behind the shelf with the first aid kit, I noticed something faint on the wall. At first, I thought it was water damage or graffiti, until I got closer and saw the words scratched into the concrete with something sharp. It wasn't a full sentence, just one line. If someone else comes, don't let them in. My breath caught, and I took a step back. The edges of the letters were rough and uneven, like they'd been carved in a rush, with a knife or a rock. I read it again, then a third time. My brain tried to come up with an explanation. Maybe it was an old joke, a leftover from some weird camping trip. But it didn't feel funny. It didn't even feel recent. The message was buried just enough behind the shelf to not be obvious, like whoever wrote it didn't want it seen unless you were really looking. And then I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the metal door. Not pounding, just controlled. Like someone knew exactly where they were and they wanted me to know it too. I didn't move. I just sat there on the floor, frozen in place, watching the door. The sound hadn't repeated. No voice followed. No rattling handle or shuffle of footsteps. Just those 3 knocks. Then silence. I remember staring at the seam between the door and the frame, half expecting to see a shadow shift under the gap. Nothing came. Still, I couldn't bring myself to approach it. I just sat there, heart thudding against my ribs, feeling like the walls had gotten smaller without moving an inch. After a minute that felt like 10, I crawled across the floor and turned off my flashlight. The darkness swallowed the room instantly. I didn't even risk switching my phone screen on. I just pressed my back to the wall and stayed there, breathing as quietly as I could. I don't know how much time passed like that. Maybe an hour, maybe 3. At one point I dozed off without meaning to, but every little creak or gust of wind outside snapped me awake again. I never heard more footsteps. No one tried the door. But the sense that someone, or something, was just standing out there never really went away. When morning finally came, I was stiff and cold and barely able to think clearly. But the moment the light was strong enough to see through the cracks in the door frame, I grabbed my bag, shoved everything inside, and left without looking back. The trail was easier to follow in daylight, and I eventually looped back toward a more familiar path. I passed a ranger station a few hours later and asked one of the staff if they knew about the emergency shelter up past the ridge. The guy paused, then shook his head slowly. "Used to be one up there," he said. "But it got decommissioned more than 15 years ago. Roof was supposed to be unsafe, place was sealed. You saying it's still standing?" I didn't know what to say, so I just told him I found it by accident and used it during the storm. I didn't mention the jacket or the food wrappers or the writing on the wall, and I definitely didn't mention the knocks. I've never gone back to that part of the park. I still hike, just never alone, and never with old maps. Whatever happened in that shelter, whatever left that warning, I don't think I was supposed to see it, but someone did. Someone was there, and for reasons I'll never understand, they didn't come in.